Alright, YouTube, I wanted to talk about why the end times probably are pretty close, and this is going to seem strange to some people, I'm sure. I'll obviously have to qualify that basic statement, of course. Not end times in the sense of Jesus comes back and kills everybody with the sword that's sticking out of his mouth, like the Christians believe, or the tales of Dajjal. However, it does appear that humanity is probably ready to plunge off a precipice, and either, depending on what situation occurs, either get plunged back into the Dark Ages or a severe dystopian future, a sort of wasteland Earth, or generally fucks up in some manner. And I say that because of this. The fact that humans developed in the first place is a bit of an aberrance when you really think about it. Over the long span of time in which life has been on this planet, there have already been many massive die-offs and mass extinctions in the world's history. The fact that human beings, that their lineage, which was relatively fragile for the most part, managed to survive up until the modern day is actually rather astounding. I read into this that there's some sort of import behind our race, not from a divine source, of course, but probably some sort of extraterrestrial bullshit or something like that. That's just how I happen to feel. Observing certain aspects of culture and human biology, I say, it appears to be the case. But let's get past all that. Let's look at the difference between man and antiquity and the things that could have killed man off back then, or in the ancient times, or anything like that, up until relatively modern times. We're talking basically 1800s, and most recently we're talking basically the last 50 or so years of human development. Let's look at the ways in which man has really made life more miserable and hard on himself, and driven himself closer by far to extinction than at any time in antiquity. We often look back at the ancient world and we say, how did people survive? They didn't have electricity, they didn't have air travel, they didn't have vehicles, they didn't have mechanized farming. How did they survive? Well, the answer is almost in the question. They didn't have, for instance, a worldwide trade network, and that trade which did exist was far more slow than it is presently. When the Black Death occurred, and came and fairly quickly spread across the Mediterranean basin and into virtually all of Europe in the course of only a couple of years, that was in the period when trade essentially was on foot or by horseback over land, or by primitive wooden ships by sea. They were nowhere near as fast as today. Now, of course, in a single day, you can leave New York City and be in Beijing. Now, you can leave New York City and be in London in an even shorter period. You can leave New York City and go to Los Angeles or Mexico City. You can leave Brasilia and be in Buenos Aires, or you can go to Johannesburg fairly quickly. We live in a world where travel is much more quick, and so the idea of an epidemic which causes a mass die-off, which has happened in human history numerous times, in prior ages might have been contained just by virtue of the fact that people were isolated. You might have some village that's largely cut off from its surroundings, which doesn't get hit by any specific disease. You would have an outbreak that affects the Mesoamericans, would not have affected the Europeans in antiquity, because simply they would have been, separated by the entire ocean. They wouldn't have been infected. It would have been limited to that continent. So because the world was broken up by large stretches of mountain and sea, sometimes something that could have caused a near collapse of society caused it in one region and didn't cause it elsewhere around the same time that the plague is causing the collapse of Europe and causing the collapse of parts of the Islamic world, and of course causes problems in Asia as well. The Mesoamericans are starting to build megaliths and going on as though nothing is happening. Around the time of the apparent century-long drought that destroyed the Mayans or any of these other, or I believe it was the Aztecs or one of those two cultures, Europe is starting to finally recover really from that era. And so you get climactic events, famines and so forth, that really now they would affect us far more. There's an interconnected world trade and movement that spreads disease around and requires, in many cases, densely populated nations to acquire foodstuffs from less densely populated nations. You looking at the California drought, it's at the very least going to cause shortages of many food supplies in this country, as well as, even more importantly, in Asia, where some of those crops go to feed the same meat we re-import at a much lower cost than raising it here. Food prices are going to skyrocket most likely unless they get some substantial drought relief. Look at, for instance, the concept of war. War in the antiquated sense meant columns of men in, metal armor or leather armor, whatever, firing, arrows at each other, hurling javelins, and sticking each other with spears and swords. That's what warfare meant, even in the interwar period, what you're talking about. Even when aerial bombardment and artillery and all of these things become developed into the rudiments of their modern form, you don't have the ability without great effort to destroy even a single city completely. Of course, you can use saturation bombing like they did over Dresden or any of these locations. And you can attain that, but it's relatively difficult to do so unless your enemy's already on their last leg and can't really fight back anymore against an air assault. But now we live in an era where one single button can be pressed, a missile can be fired from halfway around the world, and you can turn an entire city to ashes. You can also poison that surrounding area for the next 100 years or so through the same means. We live in a world where we have developed the means to utterly destroy ourselves, which is something we didn't possess in antiquity. For all of the technological advancements we've made to fight disease, to prevent warfare, to prevent famine, and all of these things, we're still utterly at the mercy of nature to supply the food that we eat, because the climate is unpredictable. It has been throughout human history, and now, even worse, and this is why I think we could be close to the end, for the first time in human history, in not even 100 years, it's only been about 70 years now, in that 70-year period, we have developed the means to destroy ourselves. At no other time in human history have such weapons been developed. They did not exist. At no other time in human history was it possible to go from continent to continent so quickly and to potentially take disease with you. At no other time in human history were so many locations reliant upon outside sources, outside resources, to simply not starve to death or to run out of some other supply that they need. Even the concept of electricity, well, resources there are limited as well. We're barely starting to make inroads into what we would consider stable green energy. We might not last long enough to even fully deploy it before we destroy ourselves. Like I said, we have never had that means before. Humanity could not have destroyed itself in antiquity. It would have been impossible, because these different groups which had diverged and arisen separately on these different continents didn't have the ability to attack each other. In the colonial era, what happens? Relatively slow sea travel that takes months across the Atlantic Ocean causes the mass die-off of Mesoamerican individuals because they happen to be taking disease with them. They're taking, can't remember exactly, I think they took stuff like typhus and typhoid with them, certainly. And then the colonists also, then they get malaria from the Mesoamerican regions, sort of their just desserts, or Montezuma's revenge as it might be termed. No, they're sort of trading diseases and taking them back and forth. Smallpox arrives in the Americas as well and causes problems, and that becomes continual problems until they finally wipe it out. Of course, they're still idiots in carrying a few live vials of it in a few labs, which is retarded to do, because what if somebody breaks in and manages to get a hold of them and disperse them? Then have to have more blanket immunizations because they haven't been immunizing people for a while. Humanity has developed the means to destroy himself. Now nature alone could destroy us. A 10-mile wide asteroid could smash into the planet, cause a massive shroud of dust that causes widespread famine and kills off 99% of all human beings, and either plunges us back into that dark age or destroys us utterly, as in there would be no humans left. But now humans too have joined nature in the capability of committing collective suicide. Again, you have two possible outcomes to this. You have either the complete dying off of the human race, or you have the nearly complete dying off of the human race, which survives and then inherits a ruined world, a wasteland, that it then has to repopulate a wasteland in which a great number of resources have been burned to nothingness, in which nature will take centuries to recover, in which even leftover human materials that would otherwise be of value to those that survived would be utterly destroyed in many cases. All of that technology, all of that knowledge is lost if nobody remains alive to continue holding it in their mind, and there's no guarantee they will successfully perpetuate that material to the other humans around them. Humans now have the ability to wipe themselves out. That's not good. Because humans I trust a lot less than I trust nature. Nature appears, for billions of years, to have sustained life on this planet to some degree. There have been mass die-offs, yes, there have been mass extinctions, but human lineage, all the way back to that primordial cell that was, slushing about in some hot spring somewhere on the early charred surface of the earth as it was blackened and filled with sulfate. Somehow that life form gave rise to all of the life on the planet. Or maybe there could have been multiple sources for different strains of life. Maybe that explains archaebacteria or something. It doesn't really matter. The point is this. We may be close to the end, not because, the asteroid's coming. Mass die-off of the bees, and thus, that's another thing humans have accomplished that nature never did, is we've killed a lot of the pollinators off and really destroyed the soil that sustains a lot of the agriculture that we use as well. We have the means to destroy ourselves, and the main problem, it's not in the collective hands and will of individuals who want to preserve themselves to use such things. It's in the hands of sometimes the worst governments that could have them. Governments which aren't really beholden to their populations anymore and probably don't even care if their populations die so long as they can stay in a bunker for the next 10 years. They don't really care. So when I see Cheyenne Mountain being reopened, when I see the Russians building more fallout bunkers, I say it's not a good situation. So yeah, you might get your end times after all, and when this happens, if it happens, which unfortunately I think it probably will in our lifetime, if it does, I can envision all of these Christians as the air raid sirens are blaring, standing on their rooftops waiting for Jesus, and Jesus is not going to come and save them, because it was their own human folly to begin with that enabled such behavior. There was no God that caused that. There was no devil to cause them to stray from the true path. They simply did it on their own and then blamed these cosmic forces while making themselves their own destroyers. They turned themselves almost, in the Christian sense, into the devil. They made themselves the destroyers of the human race, simply because of a bunch of war and a bunch of egotism, which is really what it's all about in the end. That's why people build skyscrapers that, they're not really that efficient or that tenable in the long run. They're not going to have any use in the future when the elevators stop working because of EMP blast probably, or because of a massive asteroid impact, or any of a number of different things. One person getting sick from one mutated strain of some disease in Central Africa can infect basically the entire world. And they can do it if the disease is ultra successful, as a disease of that type will eventually arise. They could spread it to most of the world in 72 hours or something like that. 3 or 4 days. That's basically all it would take to leave a trail of destruction. And the more people that get infected, the more outbreaks you have, and the more chaos ensues. And the chaos would take as many lives as the disease would. That's the sort of world that we're looking at. If I were to say that if I hadn't been born yet and I was looking from some spirit realm from afar at the world as it is today, I would say I would not want to be born into this world. And I think that's also, in a way, a first for humanity, for so much of our history. We looked at ourselves as cosmically important, or we looked at ourselves as achievers. We looked at the natural world around us and said it's basically our plaything. We're meant to manipulate this world around us because we're the intelligent ones. And we're being looked over by the gods, or we're just more intelligent than them, and it doesn't even matter if there are gods. It doesn't matter, we're human beings, we'll be here to stay, and we sort of romanticize our own role in the universe every time we write a book, every time we make a film. Ultimately, though, it's all folly, because we're fallible, and in our fallible nature, we have developed the very thing that could possibly destroy ourselves. And we haven't had a very good track record, let's face it, in our own history, of correctly applying things to good means. Mostly, we tend to make a lot of mistakes along the way. Well, it doesn't matter if you make a mistake while you're developing a new type of bow and arrow, because the worst that's going to happen, you hit yourself with the arrow, you hit your friend with the arrow, a person's dead, but it's one person out of potentially many millions of people in your tribe or empire, whatever. But what happens if we do something wrong in geopolitics today, now that we've got nuclear weapons? What happens if we do something wrong with containing a specific disease in a world where people can travel so readily? What happens? It's all-out chaos. It's the death of the human race, potentially altogether, or at least a large proportion of the human race, which, let's face it, is just as bad. In fact, with just the inclusion of nuclear weapons on this world, and nuclear power as well, let's face it, if some other catastrophic scenario happens that doesn't even involve an active nuclear war, you might get one anyway just because of accidental launch. Or a bunch of nuclear meltdowns. What if there is a dead hand that gets triggered by an explosion at some nuclear plant out in the middle of Russia, and all of a sudden the nukes start flying? And then all the other systems say, oh, the nukes are incoming, and they automatically fire. You've got a Dr. Strangelove situation going on. And these systems probably exist. That's the worrying part. It doesn't even take a willful attempt to destroy an opponent anymore to cause an all-out nuclear war in this world. And that's just one facet of how humans can end their own existence, whereas before, again, prior to the very modern period, you're talking your grandparents' infancy, or maybe your great-grandparents at this point, their infancy. In that 4-generation sort of period, we have developed the means to utterly annihilate ourselves and most other life on the planet. And not only have we developed the means to do so, the basic theory behind it, we've actually gone ahead and used such systems for fun, for experimentation, just to make them bigger, to stroke our own egos. So yes, I say the end could very well be nigh. Any day it could happen. I guess the fool hath said in his heart that it's impossible that there would ever be a nuclear war. Guess what? We've come close a few times. We've come close a few times with diseases too. Eventually, eventually we will do something wrong and one of these things will happen. Or nature will just tire of us. We will get hit by that 10-mile asteroid. We will get hit by that supervolcanic eruption. We will, get invaded by space aliens from the planet Zolb or something like that. We will eventually. It will happen. The human race will not be here forever. We could end up lasting another 1,000 years and colonizing some other planets before we get wiped out, but it wouldn't matter. It's like these people saying for the human race to perpetuate itself, it must reach out to the stars. What's the fucking point? Those stars are going to die eventually too. Are you just going to keep jumping stars for the rest of eternity until you no longer remember even where you came from and become something genetically easily distinguishable from what we would even recognize as human? We wouldn't even look the same. We wouldn't resemble ourselves now. If we spent the next 1,000,000 years in space, we would not look like this. We wouldn't speak the same language. We wouldn't have the same biological composition. We wouldn't even be human anymore, in the strictest sense. Meanwhile, those few people who stayed behind maybe still resemble what we do now. Then all of a sudden they diverged. You've got two human races. You've just seen evolution in action. It'd be almost more worrying than we get all completely destroyed or something. But ultimately, here's the catch. It's probably something we can't do anything about. Because if we don't do it, nature eventually will do it. Nature would be far more brutal too. We might accidentally leave 1% of humans alive and they end up repopulating. And then, of course, you'll have the same problem over and over again until the human race finally exhausts itself. Because you'd have sophisticated modern man. They would be knocked back in technology, but they'd still have that egotistical urge to build bigger and bigger weapons and move faster and faster and do all these other things that have led to the problems that we have today. And the other solution, dumbing ourselves down, sort of embracing hippie-trippy ideology, keep the population lower, don't travel so much, more green energy, let's live in harmony with nature, even that wouldn't save us. Because we'd still get impacted by that asteroid eventually. The human race, the fact that we're still around at this point is astonishing and remarkable. The fact that we have persisted this long, I think, is a mathematical aberrance. The fact that life on this planet persisted for as long as they think it has, I believe, is a mathematical anomaly. I think it should have been wiped out within the first couple 100 million years of its development. It should have been impacted directly by an asteroid large enough to displace it all. I guess the fact that it was just bacteria meant it was sort of hibernating there, waiting for a chance to evolve, by natural selective processes, and just didn't get wiped out because every time the asteroid hit it just spread the bacteria further and they fermented in some other pool of scum or something. Well, humans can't do that. We're a lot more fragile and need a lot more resources. We can't live on bacterial sludge anymore like we did 4 billion years ago. And we're basically the same life form, just heavily diverged, by the way. So you're almost indistinguishable from pond scum from the world in its infancy. That's a sobering thought. It's also sobering to think that anything you build, anything you say, anything you do will in time be dust in the wind. But unfortunately, it's pretty much guaranteed that this world is going to get completely destroyed at some point in the future, along with any other worlds we happen to inhabit in the meantime. That's about all. Nice, happy message. Peace out.